It is our job, our responsibility to be able to provide rest. Children at work do not grow up. Yes, they survive. Yes, they can go into a society of survival, but they are not realizing their full potential as social beings, as resilient beings, as viable beings. So what does a child need from us in order to find rest? Very simply, to do the work of attachment. We need to assume responsibility for the relationship, for preserving a sense of connection, hence the title of the book. It's our responsibility to hold on to our children, to provide an unconditional invitation to the child to exist in our presence. That is the only way they can find rest, to fulfill attachment hunger, including the appetites for sameness, for belonging, significance, and emotional warmth. We as adults are their answer. Provide more proximity than the child pursues. That's the key to a child letting go. If somebody asks you for a hug and you give them exactly the hug they asked for, will this suffice? No. How do you get them to release? By hugging them more. Well, those of you men here, if your wife asks you to bring flowers home, and you say exactly what kinds of flowers do you want, and she tells you exactly what she wants, when you bring home those exact same flowers, does it work? No. No, it doesn't. That's what's so confusing. The more you follow orders, the worse it gets. Why? Because you needed to think of it first. And if you couldn't think of it first, it needed to come from you. You needed to get more flowers or a more abundant thing. It always has to be more than is pursued. That's the absolute essence. It always has to be more. We have to trump our child's needs, not just meet our needs. There has to be a feast. And that is the whole idea of food. The celebrations of there are you convinced that there is ample here. It is a feast. And our children need to experience a feast. That there is more love and more belonging, more connectedness for there than they are seeking. We're not doing this in our society. Only those adults to whom a child is deeply attached to can provide this kind of rest. If their umbilical cord isn't hooked up to us, we cannot nurture them. If they are not feeding at our table, our food will not suffice. They need to be attached to us for us to be able to give them rest. Hence, again, we need to preserve those attachments, which we'll go more into. So this is the role of parents and not the state. We as parents may not be doing a good job, but we are their best bet. It is only us that would ever provide more than is pursued. It is only us that even sense the deeper needs of the child. It's not simply about a lunch. It's not simply about the physical needs and about being fit in society. Only us could understand and meet their hunger for connection. Finally, the need for true tears. What is this about? Well, this makes no sense whatsoever. And our whole medical profession is based on eliminating suffering in this world, to alleviate suffering. Tears have become pathologized. You can now get clinically diagnosed with depression if you cry too much. Certainly, this must be mistaken. No, it's not mistaken at all. What is meant by true tears? The tears that come when the futility of effecting change is felt. There's something quite incredible about how the brain is designed. Now again, humans are the most potentially adaptive of all creatures. We vary tremendously in our ability to adapt to loss, to adapt to lack, to injury, to disability, to handicaps. Some children adapt, some adults adapt, others do not. What is the key? The key, it ends up to be, is for futility, when it is encountered, Futility is when I'm up against that which I cannot change. When futility is encountered, when I can't make something work, when I realize the futility of an endeavor, it's not going to work that way. Then, because we only need to adapt to that which we cannot change, is when we're up against that which we cannot change, and that futility sinks in. It registers in the limbic system. In fact, the command center of the limbic system, the emotional brain. Adaptation is an emotional process, not a cognitive one, but it's an emotional process. And when futility registers, the amygdala sends signals to the lacrimal glands and the eyes water. And so that is why tears have become the symbol of recovery, of resilience, of healing, of strength, or the encountering of futility. The Greeks, again, the key to civilization. The ancient Greeks had figured out play. They'd also figured out tears. When it came to how do we, the cradle of civilization, how do we preserve this civilization? They knew they had to be able to get their population to cry when up against the things they could not change. Otherwise, they would be at war with each other. And we find out that aggression is the failure of adaptation, when we have not yet had our tears about the things we cannot change in life. And so they call the big futilities of life tragedy. And so they design comedies and tragedies, laughter and tears. And as long as they could get people to identify with the things they could not change in their life and find their tears about those things, they could have a gentle, considerate, and caring society. They had understood that. We have lost that. We had a little bit of that. We understood a little bit of that in traditional parenting circles, and they still do in many places, especially in Southern Europe. And in Eastern Europe, they still have, where they're very close to their traditions, they still have this idea that tears are necessary. And so they still have this concept that for a child to be able to adapt to things they cannot change, to be able to adapt to not having cookies before supper, to being able to adapt to a sibling, to be able to adapt to not getting their way, that the child has to have their tears. And now, this knowledge is knowledge without words. This is only intuitive knowledge. And so, when you only have the sense, as a mom or a dad, that the child has his tears, you might be a little bit primitive in terms of how you get to those tears. And so for thousands of years, parenting has been associated with getting children to cry when they couldn't get their way, when up against something, and so they just helped it along a little bit. And so for thousands of years and hundreds of cultures, the spanking was born. But in Finland, I assume in Sweden and in Canada, this has been outlawed. And yes, we saw it as a primitive way. Too many parents were hitting their children. We assumed it was abusive. But what we didn't know and realize was what was at the bottom of it. Is that parents had a traditional knowledge. Our grandparents and our grandparents' grandparents had a traditional knowledge that was in the cultural wisdom, that children needed to have their tears about the things that they could not change. And if they didn't, no transformation would take place. Now, there's no way we can go back to the spanking. There is no cultural support. But we have lost our way. And now we appeal to the cerebral cortex and to consequences, teaching children lessons that we hope they won't forget by being able to do this. In actual fact, the research has come in over and over and over again that the children who do not find their tears about the things that they cannot change are the children who are not as adaptive as they need to be by school age, to live in a world in which things don't always go their way, in which there are losses and lacks, in which there are disabilities and handicaps. They need to have their tears. Now, we can't go back to the catalyst of tears that has served us traditionally for eons. We have got to go forward to understanding that this is what children require when we're up against the big futilities of life, not being invited into somebody's presence whom we would want to be, a loss, a lack, a grief. It is a journey of tears. And through those tears, we adapt to the circumstances we need to do. We have become a tearless society. Parenting has become largely a tearless activity. The 10 most common syndromes children are diagnosed with today are becoming by some called the tearless syndromes. Not that it can cause blindness, but like Helen Keller, unless she could find her tears, there was no way back to neuroplasticity, no way back to adaptation. It is a journey of transformation. And so it is the outward manifestation of the adaptive process. Neuroscientists are now using the maze as a metaphor of the brain. This is absolutely transforming our thoughts, because we used to think that it was the breakthroughs through which the brain was built. And now we know it's not that. It's when we are up against the walls of futility in our life, when something can't work, won't work, when a message won't get through, whatever it is, and to feel the futility of it, we come to the still point. The sympathetic nervous system changes to the parasympathetic nervous system. The whole, the energy is recycled. This whole idea of adaptation is when you come to the wall of futility, there needs to be endings before beginnings. There needs to be death before life, winter before spring. In theological terms, crucifixion before resurrection. This is the fundamental principle of adaptation. It is a huge principle. What it means is, and we have lost this, our children have lost this, and we have lost our way in terms of how to do this. Why do children need to have their tears? In order to adapt to all that is not ideal in their world. Circumstances, losses, lacks, disabilities, handicaps, and dysfunction. To find true rest from trying to change that which they cannot control. To prevent becoming spoiled, the new word for spoiled is now entitled, or demanding. To develop the resilience to adversity, to learn from encounters with futility, including consequences. We now know that children do not learn from consequences after all, at least not consequences where emotion is involved. They only learn if the consequences sink in. If they don't get a good mark on an exam, that doesn't mean they'll learn from that experience that they need to study, only if they will feel sad about it. Those are the tears on the inside. The tears on the inside, as a metaphor, are the sadness and disappointment, and those are the ones that continue in life. The tears of futility are special tears, even special in their chemical composition. We can cry to many things in life, onions. We can cry to frustration. We can cry to pain. But these are very special tears, the tears of futility, very special even in their chemical composition, because they contain the metabolic products of the sympathetic nervous system as it's released. What do children need from us in order to adapt to their world? Very clear signals about the reality